Now I would like to introduce to you the concept of the iron triangle. The iron triangle represents the framework in which all projects need to be managed and the world in which a project manager lives in. So on the top we have a point of time. So this would represent a time-constrained project. The highest value closest to the point means that this is by far the most important aspect of managing the project, making sure the project is completed on time. On the lower right corner, we have cost. Some projects are managed such that cost is the most important parameter for success. And then in the far left corner, we have quality. Quality sometimes can be the most important constraint, no matter what the amount of time or what the amount of cost. So in this particular diagram, we have the red dot near the time corner. And an example of a highly time-constrained project is the music festival. For example, the music festival has to happen on a very specific day, on a very specific time, and so there is no flexibility on when the project comes to completion around a music festival. A good example of a music festival project that failed very miserably is the Fire project, the Fire Festival called FYRE. You can look this up online or you can watch videos of it. In fact, there are documentaries on how miserably this project failed and why it was such a huge project failure. In this next view of the iron triangle for project management, we're showing the red dot in the cost corner, very close to cost. What the red dot near cost means is that cost for the project is by far the most important parameter for measuring the success of the project. And the example we're giving here is a government grant or research project. Normally, a government-funded research project has a very specific budget. The budget is fixed, it cannot be changed, and to manage the project in a way that exceeds the project budget is completely unacceptable. And furthermore, it's usually equally problematic to manage the project such that the cost of the project comes in well below the budget. So sometimes on government-funded projects, the amount of time required to complete the project or the quality of the result are significantly less important than making sure that the funds that are expended while managing the project almost exactly equal the budget. In this third view of the iron triangle for project management, we're talking about a project that is constrained by quality. So the red dot is very close to the quality corner. We're representing here a project where time or cost are much less significant than meeting the quality objectives of the project. In other words, what we are going to deliver and the quality of that delivery. In this case, we're showing an example of the Airbus 380. Now, Airbus 380 is a very complex, very large aircraft, and clearly, if the aircraft is not designed and manufactured perfectly, then there could be significant compromise to quality, which could ultimately lead to serious loss of life. And in fact, this has been the case with recent aircraft manufactured by Boeing. Boeing has a significant problem that is well documented now with the 737 MAX. So clearly, on projects where we have an opportunity to deliver something that could result in loss of life, quality is a much more important constraint than time or cost. Here in our last view of the iron triangle, we're showing the red dot is somewhere along the axis of quality and time, roughly in the middle. This is how we represent a project who's constrained equally by quality and time, and where cost is really not all that significant. If time and cost were more significant than quality, then the red dot would be closer to the time and cost axis and further away from the quality corner. So an example here of this type of project would be having a newborn child. Someday we all hope to have a child, some of us do, I should say, but clearly time is a constraint. The baby will show up, no matter what we do, at about 40 weeks into its incubation. And the quality of the child obviously is also extremely important. So we have a highly constrained project from a standpoint of quality and time. However, cost is not all that important. We have maybe limited financial resources, but while we are planning on having a baby, normally we spare no cost to make sure that the child is born healthy and on time. As project managers, your job will always be to manage your projects such that they fit within the iron triangle. You will have constraints based on quality, time, or cost on all axes to some degree or another. Some of your projects will be absolutely time constrained, or absolutely cost constrained, or absolutely quality constrained. More often than not, your projects fit somewhere in the middle.
In the next couple of slides, we'll be talking about the project from a duration standpoint and the various phases of the project and how the manager interfaces with the project team during those phases. The most important part to managing a successful project is planning. It's really important to plan the project out in great detail and then to analyze all of the attributes of the project, have them well documented so that you can present them and communicate them to everyone who's involved on the project. We call these stakeholders. The first step to planning is to identify very clearly the problem that we are trying to solve or the opportunity that we are hoping to develop. So this oftentimes takes a good deal of initial thought. In other words, we need to sit down as a team and discuss what problem are we actually trying to address. Sometimes the problem is very clear, very easy to see. Other times the problem takes a great deal of analysis and maybe even some data collection. With an opportunity, we're hoping that we can, through our efforts on the project, create some value that provides opportunities to others. We're not really solving a problem, we're creating an opportunity for other people to do really well with their lives or our company to do well. More often than not, it's really not going to be your job as project manager to determine what the problem is. Usually, someone in senior management, like the CEO or the board of directors, will come to you and tell you exactly what problem needs to be addressed, or maybe what opportunity the company wishes to pursue. At that point in time, you have a very high-level perspective, but you don't really know exactly what problems you're going to be solving until you spend more time asking detailed questions. By asking lots of questions and collecting data about the problem as seen by senior management and others, you will be able to figure out much more precisely what problem you're actually being asked to solve as a project manager. The next step in the planning process is where we identify and define the best project solution and the requirements to be met for that solution. This is normally a time with very few people involved and quite a bit of analysis and thinking. It's a time when the project manager is called upon to be very creative and very thoughtful. Usually these ideas are explained to others who have a high degree of interest in the outcome of the project, like, for example, the CEO or the board of directors. At this point, we're really just collecting our thoughts to come up with an idea for the project itself. What is the solution that we're going to deliver, and what are the requirements that that solution needs to meet? Ultimately, what we're going to do is come to a consensus to clearly define exactly what the project is going to accomplish and what are the requirements for measuring the outcome of that success. Now that we've defined the project solution and we have a pretty solid and clear vision of what we want to accomplish, the next step in the process management planning process is to develop a list of very specific tasks and resources that are required to accomplish those tasks. This is a process that will involve talking with large numbers of people who will more likely than not be participants in the program going forward. By talking with them, we can now start to ask them to develop subtasks, and those subtasks with their own requirements and resources requirements. We can then consolidate all of these into one master plan, which describes in completeness all of the tasks that are going to be accomplished on the project. Once we have a detailed list of tasks and subtasks, we can now build a schedule, a control schedule. And we can also build a resource allocation plan. These are two major project planning areas that together comprehend several different layers of activities and documents that are put together in order to plan the project. We will talk more about these types of documents later in this class. Now, the most comprehensive part of the project planning process is ready to be done, and that is we can estimate our costs. At this point, we want to estimate all of the costs associated with each and every task and subtask, and all of the resources that are necessary, both manpower as well as equipment, as well as supplies, and any outside support we wish to subcontract while exercising the project. Once we have all these items together, we can now put together a budget, a project budget. The budget is something that we will live with the entire time while running the project. It is also the main vehicle that we will use for securing funding for the project in general. The last step in the planning process is to now analyze the risks and to develop strategies to either mitigate the risk or eliminate the risk. The way we establish the risks of the project is to go back and look at each and every task and discuss those tasks with the stakeholders who are responsible for those tasks. Each stakeholder will tell us where they believe they have risks. We will then be able to understand exactly what those risks are and then to come up with our mitigation or elimination strategy. Sometimes it just involves bringing more people, more resources onto the job, or maybe it involves changing what we're actually doing or how we're doing a task. During this same phase, we will be doing some statistical calculations as well. By talking with the stakeholders who are on the project, we will be able to estimate very clearly what the best case and worst case analysis will be on things like the iron triangle. In other words, we'll get a best case analysis on the schedule, the time. We'll get a best case on budget and also on the quality. Furthermore, we'll get worst case information and probably some most likely information for all three of the iron triangle corners. So from this data, we will be able to develop a statistical model to calculate the probability of success for any given time, budget, or level of quality. With this information now, we will make a decision of what the final project plan looks like. At this point, we've completed all the planning for the project, and in the process, we have created a large number of documents and diagrams and descriptions, all of which can be brought together to form a final project proposal document. With this document, we will now proceed to secure final approval of the project. Even though we've been talking with large numbers of stakeholders during the entire planning process, we will still need to get a final approval. We still need to secure a budget. We still need to get the commitment of all the line managers to commit their people and their resources to support the project. With the final project plan and the presentations associated with that, we will be able to complete the process of securing all of the commitments needed to move forward with the project. Now at this point, we're good to go. We have a budget, we have a full team of people to work on the project, we have resources, we have a schedule, we know who the customer is, we know what the outcome of the project is to look like, so it's time to get started. In the next few steps, we'll be talking about the launch and execution of the project and all the delivery activities associated with it. Now that we've launched the project, it's time for all of the members of the team to work on the project. They will be taking all of the plans that they created during the planning process, all of the tasks, the description of schedules, and the deliverables associated with those tasks, and they'll be working very hard on them. Now, your job as project manager is to keep the project on task and focused and to take care of problems as they arise. The way we do this primarily is by making sure that we keep the project inside the iron triangle. And I'll show you some techniques about how to do that later. But basically what we're trying to do is to control the project. We're trying to control the rate of progress on the schedule. We're trying to control the costs associated with executing the tasks and consuming all of the supplies, paying for the people. And we're also trying to make sure that we identify any issues that arise that cause us to deviate from our quality expectations, and to do that as quickly as possible. The next most important job of the project manager is to communicate. While we are executing the project, it's extremely important that all of the stakeholders have a regular flow of communication. The people who are executing on the project need to actually be communicating the most frequently. Some of the stakeholders, like the board of directors or the CEO, they don't need as much communication, but they do need to hear regular reports. So much of the communication is highly structured and may even take the form of regular documents that even require signature in some cases. But nevertheless, everyone on the project, all the stakeholders, need to have a regular flow of communication so that everyone knows where we are on the project, how far we've progressed, what the issues are, what have we achieved, what successes do we have, what setbacks do we have. Everyone needs to be aware of where the project is at and have a strong sense that they are part of a very important team. So communication is one of the primary jobs of the project manager, to make sure that the project stays on track and focused. As was touched on earlier, another key role for the project manager is to constantly be listening for deviations from the three elements of the iron triangle. We're looking for times when we're falling behind or ahead of schedule. We're looking for places where the budget is either ahead or behind of our schedule. And also we're trying to figure out where quality metrics are not being met easily or where we're having challenges doing that. The project manager needs to address these deviations as quickly as possible to get the project back on track. And of course, what that means is the project manager needs ways to collect data and to analyze data in order to determine whether things are on track or off track. The last set of activities the project manager is responsible for is for managing to an orderly closeout of the project itself. And this actually turns out to be much more challenging than almost any other thing the project manager is responsible for. For example, we have to make sure that every single item on the project comes to a reasonable completion. This oftentimes is challenging to do because we're running out of resources, people are less focused. In fact, there's a lot of pressure to release people back to their original group at this point in time. There also needs to be a set of documents created to describe the outcome of the project, to get the customer to approve the outcome of the project, to make sure that all payments are completed, that budgets are closed out. Another thing is to make sure that all of the resources that were allocated to the project get reallocated back into the host organization or maybe the customer if they provided it. So there are quite a large number of activities that are required to close out a project, and it must be done in an orderly fashion and done expeditiously because resources are usually dwindling fast. The final item we have on this slide that describes basically project management from a very high level perspective is that we need to finally evaluate the performance of the whole project. We want to look at each and every task carefully and determine how well we performed against our expectations, against our original plan. Did we meet our detailed objectives in our budget and our schedule, or did we not? And why did we not? We need to do what's called a root cause analysis at this point to figure out what we can learn from the places where we deviated significantly from our plans. And this way we can provide feedback as well. We can integrate what we've learned into what I call the corporate learning. We can share that information by way of documentation with other project managers and project managers to come in the future so that everyone in the corporation can learn to manage projects more effectively and more efficiently. With this then, now we are finished with the project. It's time to move on to the next goal. On this slide, we're showing a diagram called the 4D model. The 4D model is a summary way of viewing project management. The first D, D1, is define it. In this case, we are defining the problem that we're solving as clearly as possible, as well as the solution. The second phase is design it, D2. This is the phase where we are planning the project, all the items we discussed on the previous slide. D3 is do it, actually executing the project, conducting all the activities that are necessary to achieve the objectives of the project. And then D4 is develop it. This one's a little harder to understand, but what it refers to is the activity we discussed on the prior slide, where we are reviewing the accomplishments of the project and comparing our activities against our original goals and our plans, learning what we can about where we did well and where we didn't do well, and making sure we document everything well enough so that we can learn as individuals as well as at the corporate level. We can also look at the 4D model in terms of the level of activity that occurs during each of those four phases during the life cycle of a project. So on this slide, we're plotting the level of activity on the vertical axis and the project time on the horizontal axis, where the project starts in the far lower left corner and ends over on the far right. When we say level of activity, we're not defining that very well, but it could be measured in any number of ways. One common way to measure that would be in terms of the number of people working on the project, the amount of time each person is putting on the project, or it could be the amount of money that's being spent on the project. But basically, we want to measure in general terms how much activity is ongoing during each of the 4 phases. So as you can see, as we move from left to right on the project time axis, the level of activity increases during the define and design phases. It's relatively low but growing rapidly. During the do it phase, it grows very rapidly, comes to a peak, and then eventually starts to decline. This is characterized usually by large numbers of people accomplishing lots of things and eventually getting to the point where most of the work on the project has been completed, and then the activity level falls off pretty rapidly as we finish the last items on the project. Then finally, when we get into the development phase, as you can see, the level of activity as we wrap up the project is getting to be fairly low. It's lower than the design phase and more like the define phase. And this is a difficult time for the project manager because at that point in time, there's a lot of work usually that's still required to be done, but there are significantly less resources available. Now let's talk about teams. In order to execute a project, we need to have a team, a project team. This could be a very large number of people, thousands, or more likely, for our situation, it would be in the level of hundreds or less. But during the initial time when we put together a project team, we have to keep in mind that the people who are on this team normally don't work together. Normally, these people work for their line manager and among their colleagues and their peers in their line of operation. So one of the first things that has to happen when we form a new team for a project is we have to recognize that this is going to be a problematic situation unless everybody can learn to work together as a team very productively, very quickly. As project managers, it's our responsibility to understand how teams develop and become productive so that we can adjust our activities as managers to accommodate those dynamics. Here we're listing the 5 stages of team development. These are really well known, well documented, and they go as follows: forming, storming, norming, performing, and joining. And some people say instead of adjourning, it's mourning, because at that time everybody is quite happy to be part of the new team. Let's talk about these 5 stages a little bit more specifically. This is a diagram that shows the 4 stages of team development. We're representing the areas of development by this blue circular disc. And as we start at the top and work our way in a clockwise fashion around the disc, we go through the 4 stages of development, ultimately to adjourning. So in the first stage, the forming stage, we first start by convening the team. That's represented at the top. And during that time, the team pretty much behaves in a high morale mode, but not very functional. Everyone tends to be more quiet. They tend to be more inclusive, trying to find ways to make everyone feel comfortable with being part of the team. So people typically behave in a polite fashion. They're very guarded about their feelings or their opinions because they aren't interested in offending anyone at this point in time. They're also trying to develop some interpersonal connections and ways to communicate with each other. They're very businesslike. In other words, they're very formal in their way of communicating with each other because this is a proven way to talk among themselves without creating any unnecessary conflict. Having said that, though, people, even at this early stage of the forming stage, are testing the relationships. They're testing the group. They're trying to find out who has what skills, what capabilities, what the team potentially can do. So this is the forming stage. As we work our way around the blue disc, we come to the second stage, storming. In storming, the group is trying to establish roles. Who's responsible for what? Who has the authority over which items and which decisions? And usually this is a fairly contentious time for the group. There's a lot of conflict over control items. There's confrontation. In other words, people are literally fighting and arguing over things that are, for the most part, necessary in order to make the group function well. Some people really just don't feel like getting involved in the conflicts, and so they become alienated. They will actually separate themselves from the group at this point in time, unless for some reason they're pulled back in. At this time, you also see people with personal agendas, people who want to see a certain outcome or have established a certain methodology or procedure or system that favors their particular agenda. It could be very personal in nature, like they're trying to gain long-term power, control, or money. Or maybe it's just they want to be seen as the expert or the one who's most knowledgeable. But regardless, this is a time when the group is trying to work through deciding who does what in the team and resolving the places where there's conflict. Usually, this time is also a period of low morale. In other words, people oftentimes don't feel good about being part of the team. They have second thoughts about why they're involved and maybe even wishing they weren't involved. People who have been a part of project teams many times understand this, and it usually doesn't bother them much. But people who are new to doing projects can be very demoralized by this whole process.